partners also, CFR and CESPI. I'm very glad that we finally come to meet in person after all these confinement times. I'm also very happy to be very honored also to give the keynote speech to conclude this project. I would have liked to participate in this project, but maybe next time with our institutions we'll have a fruitful cooperation and collaboration. It's always very difficult to conclude such an ambitious and important project, especially if one hasn't really participated into it. So I'm conscious that many of the things that I would say have already been worked and researched at length and very thoroughly. So probably I will throw some cliches sometimes, but I will try to give a broad perspective on the global, let's say, lecture or reading of 10 years of extremely dense and very complex also phenomena and things that are, I think, modestly as researchers are still a bit soon to fully understand and fully grasp. I think these are events that we will probably make better and more sense in the future. We still need some time to investigate and to understand what happened. If, and I'll come back to that in my conclusion, if we agree that all this is over and closed. Now, reflecting on 10 years of Arab revolutions, what I have in mind is something that you probably have heard 10,000 of times during these 10 years, which is the famous sentence of Antonio Gramsci, characterizing the state of Europe in the middle of the 19th century, but that has been very much used also to characterize what's happening in the Arab world and in the Middle East. This famous sentence that he wrote from prison, letters from prison: the old world is dying, the new world is not yet born, and in the interregnum there is a thousand of monsters, or something like that, if I'm paraphrasing well. Now, of course, I could have stopped here and said, yes, this is exactly what is happening in the Arab world and in the region, and okay. So this is a sentence that we have heard ad nauseam, and I wanted to take this opportunity, being in Rome, in Gramsci's country, to maybe push a little bit forward and to deconstruct this sentence, this very beautiful and very powerful sentence, and take each one of its terms and understand, in fact, how it applies to the sequence, to the 10 years that we have just lived. So my first question is, okay, what is this old word that is dying? How do we understand it and what it is? How do we put words on it? What was this word that Arab revolts, Arab revolution, Arab upheavals, Arab whatever you want to call it? I don't like the term Arab Spring because it's too seasonal, it's a bit too European also in a way, and I don't think it renders justice to what happens. But this kind of huge upheaval, uprising, the Arab uprising. So what was this word that was, if not dead, because unfortunately it's still not dead, but that was put to death, or that was attempted to be killed? What it is? I think that the old Arab order that is maybe still moribund, still trying to survive, we can characterize it along 3 or 4 main features, and here I'm very simplistic, of course, and arbitrary. The first one is the famous Arab Mukhabarat state. I mean, this state that has been very much and very well described in books, in classics that we all studied here, academics of the Arab world, by Biblawi, Giacomo Luciani, Hassan Salami, Nazih Ayyubi in the 80s, this kind of Mukhabarat state, i.e. it's not a state in the Weberian Western sense of the term, it's more a regime, and even more than a regime, it's a kind of clique in power that is very much relying on coercive apparatus. Here we can go at length, and probably the project have done that, but I think that it still deserves to be researched. The role of military forces, security forces, that are not in fact defense forces, but they are Praetorian guards to protect a regime and sometimes a family or a clique. Syria, of course, is one example, Libya is another example, etc. This is definitely also today questioned and put into question. This kind of phenomenon that reminds us, and this is, I think, an important, let's say, takeaway from these 10 years, that we are not talking about states, we are talking about regimes. And I think that this confusion is probably one of the most potent limitations of our intellectual and conceptual approaches towards the Arab world and the Middle East, and that has probably prevented some of the Western actors to really understand what are they dealing with. When we talk about Syria, for example, we say we need to protect or to safeguard or to, let's say, to save what remains of the state, but in fact often we are talking about the regime, and the confusion is something that is very deadly contradictory. The second feature of this Arab order that is lying is this very also strange phenomenon of Arab socialism in the 50s and the 60s, state-led development that has morphed in the 80s and 90s with the infitahs, several places, into this kind of very particular type of crony capitalism. The Materi Ben Ali system in Tunisia, the Rami Makhlouf system in Syria, the Ala and Gamal Mubarak in Egypt, the sons of Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen. I mean, all this is something also that was called to be put to death by this kind of clique, crony capitalism, corruption that has in fact probably captured sometimes something like 20, 30 or 40% of the wealth of the state, if we take the case of Rami Makhlouf in Syria, for example. This was also something that leads us to ask ourselves the question of the political economy of the Arab world. In the past, today and in the future, how can we reconstruct another type of political economy and another type of productive, let's say, life for this part of the world? I'll come back to it in a few minutes. The third feature that was also put to death or called to die is the legitimacy lexicon of the old Arab order, largely based on a kind of hollow, vague and disconnected with time Arab nationalism, a kind of Nasserist discourse that was very interesting, very potent, very mobilizing, very exciting for certain people in the region at one point. It made sense, but that stopped completely to make sense, especially after, probably, it's very difficult to date it, but after 9/11, after the invasion of Iraq, after all this kind of sense of Arab steadfastness towards Israel, towards the West, towards anti-imperialism, etc., that has become completely disconnected towards or vis-à-vis the reality itself, and mainly, and this was the most important part, mainly disconnected towards the societies themselves. I think that the new generations, and in the Arab world, the new generations of the majority, the pyramid of age is completely inversed, didn't have any clue about what this would mean in the 90s, in the 2000s, in the modern world. And all this legitimacy built by the elders on anti-imperialism, on wars of national liberation in Algeria, for example, doesn't make any sense anymore for the new generations that are really in quest of something else in order to raise the state legitimacy of power. The fourth pillar that was also seriously shaken was a kind of geopolitical order of the old Arab world. You know, this kind of international relations in the Arab world that we studied in our universities in the 80s and the 90s is today dead. The pillars, we used to say the pillars of the Arab world are Baghdad, Damascus, Riyadh, Cairo, etc. All this is today gone. I mean, these countries are themselves in crisis. New powers have emerged. The centers of power have shifted very much, probably internationally and also regionally, and this is something that we have also to reflect upon. So So this is, if I come back to Gramsci's reflection, this is what is maybe not dead, but that is dying. This is the moribund state of the world. Now, what is the new world that is not born yet, that is maybe having a lot of difficulty to be born, and that maybe will never be born? We don't know. But this kind of miasma, of embryo of something that we saw the shade of in this upheaval, in this turmoil of the last 10 years. And I think this is maybe probably the most exciting and interesting part of your project and the research that we have to do. What did we see emerging, maybe not really taking shape, but trying to morph and to take shape during these 10 years? I think that what we saw were first very vivid, very deeply entrenched and very insistent calls from the civil society, and this is a term that I beg also to question. I think civil society is something very, very vague. It's also a European concept that we have to adapt to the Arab world and to our reality from the other side of the Mediterranean. But the call was very clear, although it was not formulated clearly. It was not politically formulated clearly, for a state that is, I'm sorry to be so simplistic in what I'm going to use now, but I don't find a political science term for this, a normal state. People wanted a normal state. They didn't want anymore this kind of Arab exceptionalism. A state that is not a state, an economy that is not a... No, they wanted a state, a Weberian state, an administrative state, rule of law, transparency, public sectors that are functioning, delivering public goods. I mean, really normal things, and no more grand slogans, grand big words, and etc. They wanted also a way of doing politics that was different and that was reflected and reverberated in the way they themselves organize. When we talk about this kind of leaderless, faceless revolutions, etc., it was not only because these people were not experienced enough or amateurs or because they were afraid of the coercion of the state, but this is also the way they wanted to live in the new world. In a world that is more horizontal, more equalitarian. You mentioned, Sir, the use of technology. They wanted to enter globalization, modernization, modernity, if I want to use a big term, and to become normal citizens of the world. They wanted to share what their peers and people from the same generations abroad were sharing and living. And this is not a coincidence that I think it's very interesting also to research how the Arab revolutions, each case by case, they dialogue and have an exchange with other experiences, not only in the Arab world, but abroad. In Brazil, in Argentina, in London, in New York, the Occupy experiences, how all these experiences were really dialoguing and mimetizing sometimes each other on social media and etc. From the liberal part of these revolts and from the Islamist one, and this is also something interesting, telling us something about this very intricate and complex relation between Islamism, Islam and modernity that sometimes also from the West we tend to read in a very simplistic way. The third shape of, and these two pillars, I mean, live normally in a normal state and another way of doing politics and etc. I think it was really subsumed under the slogan of dignity. This was not a revolt of hunger, this was not a revolt of big political slogans, it was not the revolutions of the 50s and the 60s, the coup d'etats and wanting to make a kind of strong state, etc. People only wanted to have some dignity. I mean, you can come back to the slogans, and I think it would be very interesting to do a kind of granular study of the slogans in Syria, elsewhere, الشعب السوري لا يزال, things like that were really very simple and simplistic. We want to live in dignity. We don't want someone to beat us because we have made a traffic contravention. We don't want to be humiliated in a public service or a public administration because We don't have the papers that are required. I mean, we don't want big things, we just want to live as normal humans. The third pillar is also a different type of economy that was wanted. I think that it's not a coincidence that, of course, we have talked at length about the concomitance of the Arab Spring or the Arab Revolt or the Arab upheavals and some climate changes, issues, the drought, the end of a certain economy. But we haven't worked enough on the concomitance, I think, of the end of the rentier era in the Arab world, mainly centered on the end of the rentier state economy. That is also something we have studied a lot, and the Arab revolutions. I think this entire political economy of the Arab world is today something new. People want to get out of this because they don't want to be assisted anymore. They want to be productive, they want to be normal, they want to have their economic dignity also, to live out of their work, not to be supported by a rentier state regime that gives them the minimum, let's say, ways of living in exchange of a complete political and intellectual silence. This is a model, this kind of what we call the authoritarian contract, I think is dead and it is to be replaced, and I think this is a huge chantier for us in the future to think about what could this new economy be in the Arab world. Productive economy, knowledge economy, small and medium enterprise economy, productive economy, etc. This is an open, I think, work site for us to think about. And last, what also was implied or was implicitly said in this 10 years of upheaval was a quest of normal relations with the world. We want to live normally with the world, not subdued and not a sense of revenge. The end of this kind of a century long of misunderstanding between the Arab world and the West, or the Arab world and the world. A kind of misunderstanding that gave authoritarian regimes in the name of nationalisms badly mimeticized or mimicked in the Arab world, and Islamism in the name of authenticity and back to the roots. We want to get out of this and become normal. We want to have normal relations with the world, with the West, with the East, with modernity and etc., with globalization. We want to enter fully globalization without intermediaries and mainly without having our state as an intermediary between us and the world. Now, the third aspect of Gramsci's sentence, which is probably the most tragic and the most painful, this is the one that probably occupied us a lot. We researchers, but occupied you, the public policy people, the real policy world. I mean, the monsters. Who are the monsters and what are the monsters that were here for 10 years and unfortunately will still be here for a while? The first one is this kind of extreme barbaric violence that I think ISIS has embodied. The extreme graphic horror of ISIS and its epigons. Chopping heads, burning people alive, burying people alive. I mean, everything you saw on social media, unfortunately, ad nauseam. This kind of unleashing of exacerbated sectarianism in Syria, for example, in Yemen, in other forms, in Libya, in other forms. This kind of hidden stock of violence that was probably encapsulated in the Arab world for decades and that all of a sudden burst out. This is something, I think, psychoanalytically that should tell us something. There was something that was really very deeply buried and that exploded all of a sudden once the lid was put off, and this is something I think that we have to really reflect upon. This dislocation of the social fabric, states that, of course, came to collapse, but societies that came to collapse. You know, sometimes the state collapses, but society remains strong. Lebanon during the civil war is maybe one case, but here we had the experience of state collapsing, social fabric completely coming to rift, and maybe unable to be patched up again in the future. In parallel to that, and here I think it's interesting to reflect or to really think about the articulation between between this and also the rise of neo-authoritarianism, neo-autocracy as you call it. Of course, it's we know it well, and we worked and we wrote a lot about this. This argument of it's us or this kind of chaos that was also ad nauseam been used by the authoritarian regimes. The Syrian case is a case, of course, is an emblematic case, the slogan that was written on the walls of Syria, Assad ila al-abad or Mahrat al-balad, Assad to eternity, or we burn the country. We burn the country, and Assad is still there, maybe for eternity, I don't know. But this kind of blackmail between it's ISIS or you stay under our boot, under our joug. So I think that this is also something that was very potent with a regional order of counter-revolution, something that really resembles Europe of the 1840s. A restoration, l'Alliance Sacrée, the sacred alliance of authoritarian regimes that came all together to fight the enemy, that is popular will, civil society, sometimes over and above the geopolitical differences. Syria is again a case in mind. When you see the Emirates and the Saudis today re-tempted in supporting Bashar al-Assad, although he has been on the other side of the fence, just because they are afraid or they have mounted this fright, this let's say this fear of rising forces and etc. is something also very interesting. With, of course, an authoritarian regime that is really unhinged after the Arab Revolution. I think that if we compare today the Sisi regime's behavior with the Mubarak regime's behavior, it's much more fierce. It's much more unhinged. It's much more uninhibited in its exercise of coercion. I know that I'm talking here in Italy with a very painful regime case that is still open. The third monster, so these two monsters, I think, were very much in dialogue and in a very unhealthy way of breeding each other. Barbarianism, the barbarity of ISIS and autocratic renewal and neo-authoritarianism. The third monster that we have seen also appearing, and probably, unfortunately, it will stay with us for a very long time, is the failed state system. The collapse order. States that are broken, that no more control the entirety of their territory. Almost all the states that have lived in Arab revolution are today states where the authority of the central government is limited in geography, in depth, and in realms. Syria, Egypt probably, with the Sinai, with other places, Libya of course, Yemen of course, maybe somewhere in the Maghreb that I'm eager to hear the specialists here, are states that no more have control over their realm and probably will never have control again as they used to have. And this is a huge challenge, of course, for the populations there and for, of course, the Western and the international order, because this is a very important security conundrum. The fourth and last pillar that was also kind of new monstrous phenomenon was this kind of fluctuant regional order that is new. Old big powers, regional big powers have fallen, new have not been born. You have contenders, Qatar, Turkey maybe, Oman, small countries, but they have not reached the level where they can organize a regional framework of security, of prosperity, of consultation, etc., etc. Saudi Arabia today is quarreling with the UAE for, let's say, preeminence. Qatar has succeeded in avoiding the siege of very potent traditional countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and etc. And we have a new architecture of security and power in the region that is completely new. I know it's a cliché, but it is true, in which the Arab world is today surrounded by non-Arab countries and forces and powers that will largely determine its future. Israel, Turkey, Iran are today the big players in the region, and the Arab world is still collapsing and entering into probably a long period of decay, which probably indicates that we are heading towards probably a new era of turmoil in the region, because this region is again, maybe 1 century later, living again a kind of existential crisis, having difficulty to define its own. I'll come to the conclusion now very quickly with 2 points because I have taken too much time. I'm trying to come back first of all to Gramsci and then a few words on Europe and what it can do, because we are here in Europe and we have the luck and the chance to have someone from the decision-making level. The first reflection on Gramsci and the century in which he lived is that, like Europe in the 19th century, I think these revolutions and this Arab revolutionary period is something that is long. I think it is still open. It is non-linear and it is sinuous. So setbacks, fluxes, again, I mean, backward and forward are something we have to get used to live with, of course politically, but also conceptually and intellectually. The comeback of authoritarianism is probably something that is normal, but is not the end of the story. The film is not yet over, so our research is still on, and it is, of course, still open. And we have to understand, and this is the message probably to the policy-making level, that as long as the root causes of these revolutions, the economic, the dignity, the political issue, the freedom, and etc., is not solved, any security approach or security-only approach will be insufficient and probably counterproductive in putting the fire off. Which leads me to my last reflection, the message to the West and to Europe. I think that, I'm very sorry to be harsh here, but I think that the West and Europe mainly has completely missed it. We, because I'm partly European also, but I think that the West has completely misunderstood what was said in this part of the world and has probably missed a golden opportunity to open up an avenue for change. We are together now in a project, we are applying for a project on European horizon and the call for democracy from the EU towards its neighborhood, the democracy promotion. If you get back to a literature, to a review of the literature of the EU for decades, I think starting from the 80s, you mentioned the Barcelona process and etc. Really, I mean, lamenting the Arab world's apathy, calling civil societies to move and to take their role, to become active, to become actors of history, etc. And when these societies have started to move in a way that was not maybe to our like, I mean, to the like of Rome or Paris or Berlin or London or Washington, we said, no, we have to get back to the old stability order. We have to put this toothpaste back in the tube, and you can never put the toothpaste back in the tube. We have to quell this, we have to put the lid again on this. This was a very short-sighted policy choice, I'm sorry to say so. It is understandable because, of course, the monsters were there. Refugees, displacement, terror, religious barbarity, and etc. But behind this, there was something much more deeply historical and sociological that we had to understand, and we didn't have the means and we didn't have the time to understand it. And as long as we don't do, or you don't do, from this part of the Mediterranean towards the other part of the Mediterranean, I'll stop here. If we don't really boldly and very daringly construct our future together, knowing that we are different, okay? Knowing that the people that will come to power in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Syria, in Libya, will not be like us or you. They will probably wear different clothes, they will have probably longer beards, etc. But we have to live together in a way or another and come to understand each other. As long as we don't do that, I'm afraid that the Arab world for the coming decades will still, like Gramsci did, still send endless letters from prison to the world. Thank you so much.